Canon R6 Mark II or Nikon Z6 III. I've used both of these cameras extensively in the field and will share with you exactly what their strengths and weaknesses are and which one might be the best one for you. And we will find out whether the almost 2-year-old R6 Mark II can still keep up with the Z6 III or might be even better. Hi, my name is Jan Wegener and welcome to the channel. I've been a bird photographer for over 20 years and focus on creating unique bird images and videos and teaching others just like you to do the same. When we compare the two camera bodies side by side, we can see that the Nikon Z6 III is a little bit larger and heavier than the R6 II. If you're used to photographing with a Nikon or Canon camera, you will feel right at home with both of these bodies as well. Because the Nikon Z6 III, for instance, has a similar layout and design to most of the other mirrorless cameras, and the same is true for the R6 Mark II as well, which has a very similar design to like an R5 or an R3 when it comes to actually using the camera in the field. The body shape might be a little bit different, but the buttons are basically all in the same places and you have similar buttons. One thing that the R6 Mark II doesn't have is a top display, and this is something that I enjoy using in the field and that the Nikon Z6 II actually has. Because sometimes if you're just carrying your camera and you want to look down, or if you're working close to the ground, having that top display can help you to dial in your settings pretty quickly. What's nice to see is that both cameras feature a dedicated photo-video switch, so you can easily switch from photo to video, even though I prefer the position on the Nikon Z6 III because it's easier to simply flick it with my thumb, whereas on the R6 II you actually have to take your left hand off the camera, off the lens, and then flick the switch. Not a biggie, but definitely something that I think is a little bit better designed on the Z6 III. When it comes to the EVF and the rear screen, the Nikon Z6 III is the clear winner in my opinion. It has a higher resolution viewfinder that's also brighter and very nice to look at, and it's basically almost like a real life experience. So I really enjoyed using that in the field, and it also has a higher resolution rear screen. The R6 Mark II is not bad at all by any means, but if you use the camera side by side, you would definitely see the difference in resolution, also just how clear and nice and bright the viewfinder is on the Z6 III. But if you just use one of the cameras on their own, you would be more than happy with either offering. One big difference in performance, and we're going to talk about this later on, is that the Z6 III comes with one CIF Express Type B card slot and one SD card slot, whereas the R6 Mark II comes with 2 SD card slots. That means that it's a lot faster to write your files on the Nikon compared to the Canon camera, and that definitely shows, for instance, when we talk about things like the buffer later on. One thing that I do like on the R6 Mark II that's always missing for me on Nikon cameras is the third wheel. On the R6 Mark II we have one top wheel for the ISO, one front wheel to do the aperture for instance, and then one rear wheel where I can have the shutter speed for instance. So if you're shooting full manual mode, it's easier to do that on the R6 Mark II compared to the Z6 III because the Z6 III only has 2 wheels. And the front wheel I actually found a little bit hard to grip sometimes, and especially if you were wearing gloves, I wonder if you're kind of slipping past that front wheel from time to time on the Z6 II. So while the Z6 III has a higher resolution LCD screen, the design of the screen is actually the same, and something that I really like because it's easy to make it forward facing, something I can't do on the Z8 or the Z9 for instance. So having the fully articulating and forward facing screen is great to see on both of these camera bodies. While there are a few differences when it comes to handling the cameras in the field, I must say that whenever I use either body, I quite enjoy myself and I find them very easy to use and I get great results with both cameras. The Z6 III has the advantage of a higher resolution viewfinder that is very nice to use, a higher resolution LCD screen, and also that top display. Whereas the R6 Mark II, for instance, has the lower resolution screens, but at the same time has that third wheel that I like using in the field. So when it comes to the body, it comes down to personal preference, but the differences between the two are not that large that I would say I definitely prefer one over the other. If you feel like both of these camera bodies are too small for your hands, you can also get an optional battery grip with both cameras that allows you to put in 2 batteries and that will also extend your battery life. However, at the moment there's no battery grip available for the R6 Mark II, and maybe it will be compatible with the new battery grips coming out with the R5 Mark II, or you'll have to get a used grip for now. When it comes to battery life itself, I find it sort of adequate for both cameras, but neither camera will wow you because it lasts you like a whole day on one battery. So with both camera bodies, I would definitely have 1, 2, 3 spare batteries with me to make sure that I make it through a nice day of shooting. When it comes to the resolution, both cameras have 24 megapixels, but the design of the sensor is very different. The R6 Mark II has a non-stack sensor, that means we're dealing with some rolling shutter, and the Nikon Z6 III comes with a partially stacked sensor. That means it has a faster readout speed than the R6 Mark II and less rolling shutter, but it's not as fast as like a fully stacked sensor that we find in the Nikon Z8, for instance. So in both cameras we will have a little bit of rolling shutter, but the Nikon Z6 III is definitely better in that regard and doesn't have as much rolling shutter as the R6 Mark II. In a lot of situations this doesn't really matter, but if you're photographing, for instance, small hummingbirds in flight, or you're doing a lot of panning with like trees in the background, you will notice that the Z6 III performs a little bit better in that area. But in the end, with both cameras we still deal with some rolling shutter. But in saying that, less rolling shutter is always better, so we definitely have to give the Z6 III credit where it's due. One big difference between the two cameras is the frames per second. The Z6 III can shoot at 14 frames per second mechanical and up to 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter. On the other hand, the R6 Mark II can shoot only 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter, but can shoot up to 40 frames per second with the electronic shutter. The biggest difference in image quality is that the Z6 III can shoot at 14-bit across the range, even with the electronic shutter, whereas the R6 Mark II only has 12-bit files available with the electronic shutter. So there's definitely a difference in image quality. For instance, if you underexpose a shot heavily and then lighten it a bit, you will have more tones and probably less noise in the dark areas when you do that with the Nikon Z6 III compared to the Canon. So when it comes to the sensor, it's actually quite interesting, isn't it? The Nikon has that partially stacked sensor, a newer design, shoots 14-bit RAWs across the range, but then again only shoots at 20 frames per second, whereas the Canon has the non-stacked sensor with a bit more rolling shutter, but can actually shoot at up to 40 frames per second. And that's definitely nice sometimes if you have a small bird that's flying past your frame, you're getting a lot more wing poses compared to just the 20 frames per second. One big bottleneck on the R6 Mark II is the buffer though. Because even though we have the 40 frames per second, the buffer is actually not very large and we can only get right around 100 files or something. So it's only a few seconds of shooting before you actually hit the buffer. So I would always recommend that you switch from RAW to C-RAW, because then you will be able to take a few more extra images. But if you're shooting at the 40 frames per second a lot, hitting the buffer will be quite common. And the big problem with Canon is if you hit the buffer, there's often a delay and it takes you 1 or 2 seconds before you can shoot again. On the other hand, one of the things I like the most about the Z6 III is the buffer, because it's basically impossible to hit. Because we have that FastSafe Express card in the camera as well, we can basically shoot unlimited, especially if you're one of the more compressed RAW file formats. But even in the full RAW, I was able to take more shots than I ever wanted without hitting the buffer. And even if you somehow manage to hit the buffer on the Z6 III, the camera will still continue shooting at a reduced frame rate. So we never have that delay that we get on the R6 Mark II. So if you know you're going to shoot a lot of action, you're going to press that shutter all the time, it's definitely a better experience on the Z6 III, because it's basically impossible to hit the buffer and you can shoot as long as you want, which I really appreciated. Another advantage of the Nikon body is that you can take a burst of images, switch to video and instantly start filming. Whereas on the Canon camera, if you take a burst of images, then switch to video, you have to wait for your buffer to clear first before you can start filming. So if you're quickly wanting to switch from photo to video and back, the Nikon also has a clear advantage here. Both cameras offer you a pre-capture or pre-shooting or pre-release mode, but it's kind of limited on both cameras. The big disadvantage of the Z6 III is that it only works with JPEG files, so for someone like me, it's basically useless. On the R6 Mark II, we do have RAW pre-capture, but it's not implemented very nice because it creates sort of a container file that you then have to manually select the images that you want to choose from on the camera or using Canon software. So it's not done very well. And the biggest downside is that once you use the pre-capture, you let your shutter button go, there will be a delay until your buffer is cleared before you can shoot again. So in the field, this is definitely not great, because if you use pre-capture, you take a series of images, there will be a 2, 3, 4, 5 second delay before you can take another image. So unless you know you will only photograph like a takeoff, it's also not super usable. And for instance, in the new R5 Mark II, this is much better implemented. So for me, while both of these cameras have pre-capture on paper, it's basically not usable in either model. Even though if I had to pick a winner here, I would have to pick the R6 Mark II, because at least you can do it in RAW, even though there's some limitations. Both cameras also come with IBIS, in-body image stabilization. And while it works really well in both cameras, Nikon here has a clear advantage, especially if you use it in combination with longer lenses like I often do when I photograph birds. Because with the Z6 III and like a 600mm PF lens or 180 to 600mm lens, you are able to take basically shake-free handheld video. And this is something that I highly value in the field. I've tried the same with the R6 Mark II and you can get away with it, but it's definitely noticeably more shaky than the similar Nikon combo. So if you know that you do a lot of handheld shooting, especially video, the Nikon combo will definitely have an edge here because it's just so nice and smooth and your viewfinder basically doesn't move at all, which is truly amazing. So let's talk about the autofocus because that is the biggest difference between the two cameras. If you're not shooting birds, the cameras are a lot closer together. But if you're photographing birds like I do, then there will be a big difference in performance between the two cameras. And the reason is that Nikon has left out the dedicated bird mode that we find on the Z8 and the Z9. We only have the animal or the auto mode available, but both of these modes are not as good as finding birds compared to the Z8 or the Z9 that have the dedicated bird mode. So if you're photographing birds, especially small birds or birds smaller in your frame, it will be more difficult to do that with the Z6 III compared to the Canon R6 Mark II. The R6 Mark II is one of the best autofocusing systems on the market and finds even tiny birds amongst the grass with ease. So while the Z6 III has the faster sensor and the better readout speed, when it comes to the autofocus, especially for photographing birds, the R6 Mark II is my winner here. So while saying that, I've been able to capture fantastic photos with both cameras in the field, but the ease of use with the autofocus and how easy it finds your subject definitely gives the R6 Mark II an advantage. Now this might change in the future if Nikon decides to upgrade the Z6 III also with the bird detection autofocus, but for now we don't have that and I can only judge what we have now, and in this current situation the R6 Mark II can find and stay on the birds better than the Z6 III. And no matter what camera body you're using, one of the best ways to improve photography is actually to improve your image editing and get more skilled when it comes to editing your photos. And I would love to help you on your journey to become confident when it comes to image editing with my PROSETS, my Masterclass and my brush pack. With my PROSETS, I allow you with just one click to transform your RAW files. And in my Masterclass, I teach you step by step everything you need to know in Photoshop to get great results. And with my brush pack, I make layer masking for you in Photoshop so much easier. So if these are of interest to you, make sure to check these out down there in the description. A lot has been said about the lack of dynamic range in the Z6 III and that other cameras, even the older Z6 Mark II, has a better image quality. But at the same time, this is not really something that affects my kind of photography, and I think a landscape photographer, for instance, would struggle a lot more than that. For instance, if you're shooting your images very underexposed to keep the detail in the sky, but then plan to brighten your foreground by like 3 stops, you'll probably feel more limited with the Z6 III, and an R6 Mark II, for instance, will probably give you better image quality or something like a Z8. But in most cases, and if you expose your images properly, the difference in dynamic range or the sort of lack in dynamic range is not something that I really notice when using the camera in the field. It might be there, but it doesn't really show in my applications. The noise performance of both cameras is very good, and I wouldn't say one is much better than the other. Both cameras can easily be used at like 3200 ISO, 6400 or even 12800. And if you run those files through DXO Pure RAW 4 or Adobe Enhance, for instance, you will end up with beautiful clean files that basically have no noise in it at all. So while both cameras perform quite well in the field when it comes to image quality and noise performance, I would give a slight edge to the R6 Mark II. The files out of that camera just look super crisp, super clean and nice and sharp. In saying that, I think that image quality is actually a little bit overrated because we've gotten to a point now where all cameras have great noise performance and great image quality. So the main deciding factors for me are not the image quality or noise performance anymore because they're excellent in all cameras. And we also have our software helpers that allow us to get rid of all the noise in the files. So other things like the frames per second, the autofocus performance or the image stabilization are a lot more important for me and more deciding factors than the image quality overall. Of course, I want great image quality, but I basically get that out of every single modern camera. When it comes to video, both cameras are excellent and offer us great resolutions and frame rate and also eye-tracking autofocus. When it comes to filming birds in particular, I would give a slight edge to the autofocus of the R6 Mark II because the Z6 III has the missing bird mode. If that bird mode was there, I would say the Z6 III is probably better, and I base that on the performance of a Nikon Z8 for instance, because that has one of the best video autofocus in the business for birds. So if you're filming anything else, people for instance or yourself, I'm sure both cameras will do well, but I would probably give an edge to the Nikon autofocus, whereas for birds in particular, because of that missing bird mode, I think the R6 Mark II also has an ever so slight advantage here. But when it comes to the resolution and frame rates, the Nikon Z6 III definitely has a large advantage. Because most noticeably, the R6 Mark II is missing 4K 120 frames per second. This is something that the Z6 III offers us, even though it has a 1.5 crop applied. But for bird and nature photography, this can actually be quite helpful sometimes because oftentimes we're not close enough to the bird, and then having an extra 1.5 crop applied actually works out in our favor, like when I was filming this kingfisher eating the crabs. If you're after the highest possible frame rates, the Z6 III also has an advantage, being able to shoot in 240 frames per second in Full HD, whereas the R6 Mark II only shoots in 180 frames per second in Full HD. Both cameras can record 6K RAW as well, but the Nikon Z6 III can actually do that in camera, whereas on the R6 Mark II you actually have to use an external recorder to be able to record 6K. The Z6 III also has 5K available up to 60 frames per second and 4K up to 120 frames per second, whereas the R6 Mark II only has 4K up to 60 frames per second available. So when it comes to video work, the Z6 III definitely has a big advantage and a lot more options and resolutions and frame rates available. Both cameras also allow you to record in log to get a maximum dynamic range. When it comes to video quality overall, I think the two cameras are quite similar and you can get excellent results with both of these bodies, but the Z6 III definitely have more options and different modes available. If we're choosing cameras from different brands and deciding which one to buy, an important aspect is also the lens offerings. And if you're a wildlife shooter, you will have noticed that Nikon has a great offering of very different and well-priced wildlife lenses for us available, like the 180-600, the 4.0-400, the 600 6.3, the 800 6.3 PF, and the 2.8-400 and 600mm lenses with the built-in teleconverters. So there's basically something for everyone available at any price point, and they will all give you fantastic image quality and results in the field. For instance, I used the Z6 III with the 600mm PF lens and even the teleconverters and got some stunning results. So in that sense, Nikon definitely has a little bit of an edge over Canon. Canon also has fantastic offerings, especially quite cheap ones like the 600 and 800mm lens or the 100-400mm RF lens. We have the 100-500, the 200-800, and then we also have the 100-300 f2.8 and the 400 and 600mm big wide prime lenses. So there's definitely some great options there as well, but when it comes to pricing and overall performance, I'd give a slight edge to Nikon here, even though a camera like the R6 II with the 100-500mm lens will also give you amazing performance. In saying all that, which camera is the right one for you will ultimately depend on you, what lenses you want to pair with, and your budget. Because at the moment, the R6 Mark II is very competitively priced at about $2,000 US, whereas the Z6 III comes in at $2,500 US, and I know in a lot of other countries it's actually quite high priced, almost similar to like a Z8, a little bit cheaper, but not that much cheaper. So if you have a Z6 III and it's very close in price to the Z8, I might be tempted to actually jump over to the Z8, especially if you're a bird shooter, because then you will have that dedicated bird autofocusing mode that will give you a better overall performance. But if you're only deciding between the Z6 III and the R6 Mark II, I think you can't really go wrong with either camera. Both have some strengths and some weaknesses, and interestingly, they're almost the opposite kind of cameras. The Z6 III is the more modern camera that has a higher resolution viewfinder and LCD screen, shoots up to 20 frames per second, has the faster readout sensor, and also the better overall video features. The R6 Mark II, on the other hand, is a little bit older, but therefore comes at a better price point, has fantastic autofocusing that definitely beats out the Z6 III when it comes to birds at least, and also has some fantastic other features like up to 40 frames per second and also a working pre-capture in RAW mode. So in the end, you have to decide which of the features that we've gone through in this video are more important to you. Do you value like 14-bit RAWs across the range, or you don't mind going down to 12-bit in the electronic shutter mode? Do you prefer 20 frames per second or 40 frames per second? Do you mind a bit of rolling shutter, or do you not want any rolling shutter at all? These are all questions that I can't really answer for you. Ideally, we merge the two cameras together and get one perfect mid-range camera, but I think both of these cameras are very competitive in their respective field. And which one is the right one for you really depends on what lens you want to pair the camera with, what other lenses you already might have, and which of the features that both of these cameras you value the most. In conclusion, I would say that the Z6 III is the better overall camera with the better overall performance and specs. But at the same time, for bird photography in particular, I will have to give an edge to the R6 Mark II because it has the better autofocus for birds. The missing bird detection autofocus really hurts the Z6 Mark III in this area and makes the R6 Mark II quite competitive. If later on the Z6 III also gets a bird auto detection mode, then this field might shift even more in favor of the Z6 Mark III. But for now, especially for bird photography, I think there's a slight edge with the Canon, even though the Nikon is probably the newer, nicer, and overall better performing camera. And on that note, I think it's a great time to wrap up this video. Please let me know all your thoughts about the two cameras down there in the comments. Are you using one? Have you used one? Are you going to buy one? Let me know. Give me a thumbs up for the video and hit that subscribe button and check out my channel membership. And I will see you in another video very soon. Bye.